Chicago is a city born from the Potawatomi tribe and settled by trader Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable in the late 1770s. 100 years later, this Midwestern city would be ravaged by the Great Fire of 1871, then rise from the ashes with skyscrapers of architectural wonder. And as Chicago entered the Roaring '20s, it became an epicenter of mob crime. On one fateful Valentine's Day, one unheated brick garage would etch itself into history. On February 14, 1929, this iconic era of romanticized American crime came to a gruesome climax. 70 rounds of ammunition were emptied, turning a simple garage wall into a gruesome artwork of blood and bullet holes, and sending 7 men to gangsters' heaven, where they'd live forever in infamy. January 16, 1919, marked the dawn of the enforcement of the 18th Amendment. The amendment, which was preceded by the temperance movement, banned the production, sale, and transport of all intoxicating liquors, including wine and beer. This act would be the genesis of the Prohibition era. Gangs rained violence across Chicago, fueled by the sale of bootleg liquor. And in this reign of violence, 2 kings rose to the top: Bugs Moran and Al Capone. Chicago arch rivals who would stop at nothing in a Game of Thrones style war that would come to a bloody end at these doors. The SMC Cartage Company garage on North Clark Street was a front for the Irish-American Northside Gang, run by Bugs Moran. This garage is where Moran's men awaited what they believed to be a standard delivery of bootleg whiskey. This unassuming structure, made to fix a car or two, was squeezed between 2 standard buildings more than twice its size. On the morning of February 14, 1929, a driver wearing a chinchilla topcoat and gray fedora arrived at the garage shortly after 10:30 a.m. In the car with him were 3 other men, 2 of them dressed as police officers. The 4 men charged through the door into the SMC Cartage Company garage like police performing a raid. These men, however, were not the police. They worked for Al Capone. Capone wanted to take Moran out once and for all and confirm his position as the #1 mob boss in the country. Once inside, the 4 men marched across the room, flanking the 7 men who were unlucky to be inside. But Bugs Moran himself was not among them. Capone's gang forced all 7 of Moran's men to stand up and face the wall. That whitewashed brick wall would, for most of them, be the last thing they'd ever see, because within minutes, Capone's gang emptied 90 bullets into their backs. The preferred weapon used by Capone's gang was the Tommy gun, nicknamed the Chicago typewriter. It was a true weapon of raw destruction. The sounds of annihilation echoed through the Chicago streets like thunder. Witnesses in nearby buildings ran out to see the commotion and spotted the black Cadillac fleeing the scene. 7 victims lay before the bullet-ridden wall. They were Moran's deputy and second-in-command, Albert Kachelek, his bookmaker, Adam Heyer, his business manager, Albert Weinschenker, 2 of Moran's associates, Reinhard Schwimmer and John May, and Peter and Frank Gusenberg, who were reportedly Moran's best killers. When the police arrived at the shootout, Frank Gusenberg, who had been shot with 22 bullets, was still alive. When questioned by the police as to who shot him, Gusenberg said, "No one. Nobody shot me." Gusenberg died 3 hours later, loyal to the thieves' code of honor he lived by. Despite Moran's absence at the massacre, Capone's plan had worked. This act of violence would become such a hard blow on Moran that he lost control of the territory he once ruled. And in that absence, Capone rose to be king, bringing in $100 million a year at his prime. Moran was quoted as saying, "Only Capone kills like that." But Al Capone was conveniently vacationing in Florida at the time of the massacre and was never charged for what is now known as the St Valentine's Day Massacre. One possible lead in the case was Machine Gun Jack, Capone's bodyguard. Machine Gun Jack was arrested for being the one who set up the falsified whiskey delivery that brought Moran's crew to the location. His alibi, however, was that he was with his wife, Louise Rolfe. Conveniently, he'd recently married Rolfe, making it impossible for her to be legally pressured by officers to testify against him. Louise Rolfe became known as the Blonde Alibi. The Valentine's Day Massacre was the climax to an era already defined by violence and mob warfare. 2 years later, Capone would end up in prison, but not for his role in the Valentine's Day Massacre. Al Capone was arrested for tax evasion charges in 1931 and was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. In 1934, he was transferred to a newly opened federal penitentiary for difficult-to-manage prisoners, Alcatraz. Al Capone died on January 25, 1947. Out of all the enemies he'd made throughout his life, the killer to take him down would be syphilis. Bugs Moran died of lung cancer in 1957. But the deaths of Moran and Capone didn't end the legend of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Years later, the modest brick building was turned into an antique shop and warehouse, but Chicago residents only visited to gawk at the site of the infamous massacre. Unable to outrun its bloody history, the SMC Cartage Company garage was demolished in 1967. Collectors rushed to get their hands on the bullet-ridden bricks, and they ended up in the hands of George Patey. George was a Canadian businessman who had the 414 bricks shipped to Canada. After many failed attempts to make money off of the morbid bricks, they found a home in the Banjo Palace nightclub in Vancouver, British Columbia, where men could aim at the bullet holes in a urinal covered by plexiglass. Known now as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre Wall, the bullet hole-ridden bricks currently reside in the Mob Museum in Las Vegas, Nevada. The vicious site where the SMC Cartage Company garage used to be is now an empty lot. The villains of this vicious story live on in movies that romanticize their adventures for moviegoers and pulp novel readers.
These people. Come on, move! Hands on the wall.
When the bricklayers created the foundation of this garage, they couldn't foresee it would become a monument of a violent era. But those bricks have become as famous as Chicago's greatest skyscrapers. And if those walls could talk, they'd tell us that the true killers were